Thank you, Thomas. So good evening, everyone. Welcome to Innovation in Linguistics talk series presented by the journal Cognitive Semantics. Today, I'm honored to host the 14th lecture in this series. Before we begin, I'd like to provide a brief introduction to our journal. Cognitive Semantics is a peer-reviewed international journal focuses on exploring the relationship between meaning and mind. We welcome submission of unpublished research from all theoretical perspectives within linguistics. Our founding editor and editor-in-chief is Professor Fuyin Thomas Lee from Beihang University. The journal's consulting editor includes George Lakoff, Ronald Lakoff, and Leonard Telmy. Our review editor is Professor Ed Fuyin, and our associate editors are Professor Dylan Glenn, Martin Helper, and Francisco Rose de Mendoza. We are supported by a dedicated team of editorial assistants, including Dr. Liu Na from Central China Normal University, and Li Zifan, Yang Yuhang, and myself from Beihang University. Today is the 14th lecture of Innovation in Linguistics talk series. The information and recording of the previous 13 lectures can be found on our WeChat platform and YouTube channel, which are shown here. Today, we are honored to welcome Professor Jordan Zlatev to give a lecture, who is a professor in Journal in Linguistics at Lund University. He was the first president of Swedish Association for Language and Cognition, that is SALC, from 2006 and to 2009. At present, he is one of the research director of the Center for Cognitive Semiotics established in Lund in 2009. His research focuses on language as a predominantly conventional nominative semiotic system for cognition and thought, and especially on its biocultural evolution and developed in children. This implied careful investigation of its relation to other semiotic resources, such as gesture and its dialectic relationships with cognition and consciences. Today's topic is Constraining Metaphor and Metonymy in Language and Depiction, a cognitive semiotic approach. So now let's welcome Professor Jordan.
Thank you very much, Celia, for this introduction. Thank you, Thomas, for inviting me. I didn't know it was such a impressive sequence of series that you've had already with people from, including Noam Chomsky and as well. So I'm also honored to be here. I hope it's appropriate enough. I hope everybody can hear me well. I'm at home, as you can see, upstairs. If the connection is not good enough, I won't be having videos, which could be an issue. I'll have pictures, but I won't have videos, so that shouldn't be hard. But if for some reason we have any connection, let me know. Just break in, Celia or Thomas, and let me know, and then I'll move downstairs. But I know the connection is stronger. But my wife is down there, so she told me if you can be upstairs, it's better. Yeah. Okay, the other thing I have to apologize is my voice. I have a cold, so we don't have to worry about infections. But I may be well, you understand. And the third kind of apology is that the talk that I'll be giving, I just told Thomas, is slightly adapted from the one I gave also online to the Cognitive Linguistics Conference in Shanghai last year. I try not to repeat myself, but our ability to come up with new things is limited. So yes, if you did attend that conference there, you may recognize some of the things. Okay, and then it's time to me to share the slides. right? And you can see them now, right? And you can see them moving, right? You see the second slide now.
Yes, I now see the colorful slide.
Colorful slide. Good. Okay. So yes, constraining metaphor and metonymy in language and depiction. This is ongoing work. It's not published yet. It's submitted to a journal. I presented it first at the Cognitive Linguistics Conference in Rzeszów last spring. It's in Poland, and then I had a chance to cross over the border and go to Ukraine. I was invited by the Catholic University of Ukraine in Lviv, so presented this and got feedback also from Ukrainian professors and students. And then, as I said, I gave a version of it in Shanghai. And as I say, it's not published. It's a special issue for a journal coming from the Rzeszów conference. And yeah, so my aim is to present very briefly what cognitive semiotics is, because all of you will know cognitive linguistics. Cognitive semiotics is, you can say, a close relative, overlapping, but this is the last 10, 15 years I've been engaged in helping to establish cognitive semiotics as a field, even as a discipline. We have a PhD program in cognitive semiotics in Lund. After my predecessor, Göran Sonesson, passed away, sadly, last year, when Silja was introducing me as one of the directors, I have to say that unfortunately, I'm the only one and the only professor. We have postdocs and PhD students, but so there's a lot of work also in establishing it even institutionally, this field and discipline. The motivation and sedimentation model, as I'll explain, is a model that emerged in our research group the last 6 years. If you were in Düsseldorf last summer for the Cognitive Semiotics conference, Cognitive Linguistics, I'm sorry, ICOC conference, I mentioned that a bit, though I didn't talk about metaphor. It was kind of a more theoretical, philosophical talk that I gave that time. It will be more linguistic this time. And then we come up with for the first time, still unpublished, an integrated definition of metaphor and metonymy. As you know, very contested topics. That how exactly the two are related. We are inspired by work from Peirce, but mostly closer to linguistics. Roman Jakobson will be quoting. The great 20th century linguist, on how the two are related. If metaphor is mostly about iconicity, metonymy is about contiguity for Jakobson. And then comes the question of constraining, because I mean, some of these notions tend to explode. I mean, metaphor becomes something so, according to some definitions, such as those by Lakoff and Johnson, of cross-domain mappings or etc., it's hard to have a grip on it. What exactly is metaphor and what is not in relation to blending, analogy, and so on. So I'm not saying that everybody should follow our approach, but if you do follow cognitive semiotic approach, where we always request for there to be an expression, always for something to be assigned, there always has to be something tangible that expresses it in words, in gestures, in pictures. So when I talk about depiction, I'll be talking about the picture or picture making and staticodynamic. And then I'll give some examples of pictorial metaphor and metonymy, how they abide by this definition, and some conclusion, and we'll open the discussion. Okay, cognitive semiotics and the motivation and sedimentation model. There is this journal, should have picked a better picture, called Cognitive Semiotics, that represents our field. We organize biannual conferences and publish books like the one here you see, with which I co-edited with Derek, meaning my communication. So if we have to define cognitive semiotics in a few lines, this is what I could say. So it's a new discipline that combines concepts and methods from semiotics. And what is semiotics? The study, science of meaning, meaning making. Linguistics, the study of language, we know, and cognitive science, the study of mind. With the help of phenomenology, which is the tradition that goes back at least to Edmund Husserl, the beginning of the 20th century, and is developed all to these days by people like Sean Gallagher and Dan Zahavi. And at least in our approach, phenomenology has been very important to help these other fields come together. So I usually show some diagram like this. So you can come into cognitive semiotics from linguistics, and in particular from cognitive linguistics, like many people have done, who have, let's say, come through the study of metaphor or of multimodality or iconicity, as you know, is also a topic in cognitive linguistics. You can come at it from semiotics proper, where people still debate on what exactly is a sign and when do children start using signs, that the ontogenetic perspective that Celia mentioned, but also the phylogenetic, which non-human animals are sign users. How could we tell what kind of signs? And cognitive science, the interdisciplinary study of the mind, and in particular those so-called enactive approaches, the enactive approach to cognitive science. Evan Thompson, Mind in Life, is a very good example that conforms to our approach to meaning making. And phenomenology is this field that helps affect the bringing together. Merleau-Ponty, as you probably know, is one of the great phenomenologists of the 20th century, the French philosopher who took the work from Husserl and radicalized it and also made it more empirical, you could say, because he was also a professor of child psychology. And he also lectured on nature and died quite early. Otherwise, right in the process of establishing something that was a form of cognitive semiotics before the term. Here's what he says, for example. The relation between matter and form is called, in phenomenological terminology, a relationship of Fundierung, the German term meaning foundation, ground. So the symbolic function rests on the visual, he says, but he means the bodily as on the ground. And for many of you coming from cognitive linguistics, experientialism, Lakoff, etc., this will not be strange. It's just that Merleau-Ponty and phenomenologists give it even more experiential take than, let's say, the way Lakoff and Johnson did. And there's a very nice book on the philosophy of Merleau-Ponty by Lawrence Haas. It's called The Philosophy of Merleau-Ponty. And towards the end, when it comes to language, well, when he reviews how Merleau-Ponty deals with language, he says language is a marvelous conjunction of social cultural structure sustained by carnal bodily life, but a structure which can be transformed by embodied acts of expression. In a phrase, carnal life and non-material linguistic structures in a relation of reversibility. And this is what I talked about in Düsseldorf in my plenary, this reversibility. I won't go more into Merleau-Ponty, but this has been one of the strongest inspiration for the motivation and sedimentation model that I'll be using. Another inspiration is another great 20th century linguist called Eugenio Cucherio. He was originally from Romania. Then he went to South America, established schools in linguistics there, and then came back to Europe, Germany, and so he's very well known in Latin, Romance, and Germanic linguistics. Not so well known in English-speaking linguistics because he mostly wrote in those other languages. But this is a very good paper that I could recommend. It's called Linguistic Competence. What is it? Or what is it really? So this is his famous matrix. He divides the concept of language in a 3x3 level: universal, historical, individual on the vertical. So in universal language as such, in speaking historical, specific lands, specific systems, as the structuralists would say, an individual discourse, what we're doing right now. And then on the horizontal, he has this activity. The Greek word says energia. This is an old Aristotelian term that was used by Humboldt, energia ergon. Ergon is the one on the right. That's the product. And dynamis is knowledge or practical knowledge that unites them. So again, we can focus on the activity of language, the languaging, as many say now. We can focus on the product, the corpus. But we can also and need to also include the dynamis, the knowledge perspective. So I've written before using trying to integrate ideas from integral and cognitive linguistics, 2011 paper, from cognitive to integral linguistics and back again. Some of you may have seen. But that's not what I'm going to be talking about either. I'm just acknowledging Cucherio as inspiration. it's rather so the MSM consists of 3 levels, just like here, but we kind of remember to turn upside down. What is the universal level for Kusheria becomes the embodied level for us, and it's at the bottom. It's not more, and it's more than language. It includes what we sometimes call pan-human capacities. There are inter-individual differences, but in principle, all human beings have the capacities for cross-modal perception, uniting the senses in perceiving. We all have body schemas and body images, but the body schema being the more unconscious and the body image being the more conscious version of the two. We all have the capacity for bodily mimesis. Merlin Donald, Origins of the Modern Mind. He contributed with this notion of mimesis that we have worked on as a stepping stone in evolution and in child development to language. We all have embodied intersubjectivity. We wrote a paper with you and Bloomberry about that 2016, including, again, notions such as affordances, many of the things I mentioned before, cross-modal perception and so. And we all have the capacity for analogy making. And we do analogy through our bodies, not just for our brains or disembodied minds. So, for example, without much reflection, all people across culture can see what should substitute for the question mark, what kind of figure and what kind of color. It's a perceptual judgment, right? It's not, you don't even need science or language to have gone to school to see that what fits best in that context is a gray star. If you follow the pattern before, the kind of things that are included in intelligence tests. That's the lowest level. On the highest level, we have what we call the situated level, which, going back, you see that corresponds to what Kusheria called the individual level. Situated because it's not an individual human being. This is why I chose this illustration from, university students hanging out on the grass. It's about a contextualized activity. It could be differ in degrees of formality and formality. The one we have right now is a relatively formal activity. I'm giving a talk, you're listening and making notes and so on. Here is a more informal one, but they're characterized by languaging, by unpredictable things happening. This is, of course, the energia thing that we had before. Todd Oakley, who had worked with blending before, now works in cognitive semiotics, talks about meaning construction. Other people talk about sense making and participatory joint sense making, and we have written about polysemiotic communication, kind of disentangling the notions of multimodality that has most to do with the senses, seeing, hearing, touch, taste, smell, maybe proprioception is a 6th sense, maybe a 7th, and polysemiotic communication means combining gesture, language, depiction, music, different semiotic systems. But they have to be glued together, but why Kusheria called the historical level, and we call the sedimented level. And the sedimented level is very culture specific. So illustrated by this, picture showing greetings in 2 different cultures. It inquires socially shared knowledge, called by Barth as scripts, writing systems, symbolic notions, language norms, etc. This is one representation of this MSM. And you see the embodied at the bottom. There's this other dynamic of structure of process that I won't be talking much about, but you can have, as you see, something that is relatively more ergon, more in the middle, something relatively more stable, and something more dynamic on each of these levels as well. But the important thing is here, why motivation? Red, because all these pan-human, in principle, capacities motivate situated sign use, not just language use, but any kind of sign use on the situated level. These sediment into norms, schemas, rules, etc. in the middle. And these co-motivate creative use, sign use on the situated. So you have all the time this double motivation or double grounded from the embodied and the sedimented level onto the situated. You may wonder, where did this metaphor come from? This model come from? Well, I was walking, oh yes, and you have this kind of horizontal, relatively short-term, quicker processes of sedimentation and motivation. So you see the more stable forms in the middle, they motivate, they do not determine. The creative forms on the right, which in turn, once we've used, let's say, a new metaphor or a new phrase, this may become sedimented into a kind of norm. This is a picture that I took this morning in my walk in the outskirts of Lund. There was this ravine, and there was formed 12,000 years ago as the ice melted in Northern Europe, and when they melt, they form ravines, and so this is something that is 10,000 years old. We have a sediment, right? We have several layers in the middle that have been sedimented by dust and earth falling out and forming this sediment. So this is, if you see, kind of a metaphorical or a source domain image of the MSM. We have something more dynamic in the bottom, which was the river flowing. We have something that is very open and alive and unpredictable at the top, which is the sun in the air. But in the middle, they're interlinked by these sediments. Okay, so we actually applied it first to the formation of language norms on these various levels and kinds, not just about correct, incorrect, but appropriate, inappropriate, and so. With Simon de Wilder, you know, these are these parallel conferences on figurativity that some of you may have gone to. This one was from a conference in Braga, in Portugal, where we applied it, but how people talked about the divided self. I'm not myself today, for example. We analyzed with Johan Bloomberg the notion of linguistic relativity, how it can be some of the debates about whether there is or there not linguistic relativity can be facilitated with the help of this model. Sometimes people are talking across each other, depending on whether they're focusing on languaging, on the process, versus on the more stable structure, versus they're focusing on the more universal parts at the bottom. With a previous PhD student, George Stamboulidis, we analyzed, or well, he analyzed mostly, and we helped Greek street art, graffiti. I'll have one picture from his corpus. And then we looked at metaphoremes across languages. Metaphoremes, I'll explain the term soon. This is metaphors on the sedimented level, when they already have formed constructions, schemas. Yes, construction is clearly something that will belong on the sedimented level. A construct, perhaps it's more on the situated, right? Because it's not stable yet. And since we analyzed types, constructions, we talked about metaphoremes here. And we looked for which, is there a degree of similarity? So unsurprisingly, the Germanic were more simpler to each other, and as were Estonian and Finnish. Spanish was different, but not as different as my native Bulgarian. You may know that before I came to Sweden almost 40 years ago, I grew up in Bulgaria and came to Sweden in 1986. And then we also applied it to metaphors for stress and anxiety in therapy discourse. And I have some examples from this, but not much, because if I go there, I won't present some of the new work, unpublished work on pictures. Oh, yes, and Todd Oakley and I talked about how different scenarios for the origins of money can be applied. So it's not a model that is just applicable to language and not only to metaphor. Okay, metaphor and metonymy in MSM. So what are the criteria for a contemporary theory of metaphor? When I'm using a contemporary theory of metaphor, I'm not using in the Lakoff 93 sense, in which Lakoff mostly referred to his own approach to metaphor, which was, as we know, conceptual metaphor theory called, but kind of a more neutral characterization of any kind of contemporary theory of metaphor. What does it have to fulfill? Well, we've learned metaphor is not just about communication, and it's not just about cognition, it's about both. So the question is still how to combine the two. It's not only dealing with universal or pan-human primary metaphors, but also with culture-specific aspects and how the two combine. It involves more stable structures, metaphoremes of the kind that I mentioned, but also contextual processes and the interaction. It's not just expressed in language, but also in gesture and depiction, and together in polysemiotic communication. And also we need to provide relatively clear and interrelated theoretical and operational definitions. I think that's what people decided. Without the latter, the risk is that people talk across each other because they define metaphor in different ways, and then when they do metaphor identification procedures, they do different ones, and they come up with different empirical results, and then they wonder why they disagree. This is something that Kalina and I wrote that I found useful also in teaching, not just about metaphor, but about this general principle that comes from the philosophy of science. So if we start from the top, which we most of the time do, we start with a phenomenon that doesn't have clear boundaries. So metaphor is a phenomenon to begin with before it becomes a theory or defined in one another way. In CMT, DMT, deliberate metaphor theory, or other schools approaches, and that's called construct validity. Those constructs have to map the phenomena, or else they're about something else than what they need to describe. But that's fine if we're doing just a theoretical account. But if we also want to dig into empirical examples, then we need to operationalize how would this theoretical definition would result in identification procedures, for example. And I'll give some examples of that, though, but not much, because again, that would push us aside, and we're still working on identification procedures for pictorial metaphor. And that's called translation validity. Let me give an example from a film from last year, a very nice indie film, Finnish film. I can't remember what the Finnish title was, but the English translation was Fallen Leaves. The French on the top is more like, you see, dead leaves. When you translate a metaphor, you cannot do it one-to-one. Why? Well, because fallen leaves, fall is also being applied to these people. So in this way, fallen is perhaps better than dead because they are outsiders, and they meet, and well, I won't tell you the film, but here's like a very brief illustration of how you can apply this to MSM, to this example. So let's say from the top, we have fallen leaves, and also not just the words, but also the context, the image. This dog in the middle plays an important role. All of you who are dog lovers would identify or recognize the importance of this very empathetic look that connects them. So there's a lot of figurativity in this image, but there's also metaphoreme, fallen axe, right? So if someone has fallen, then well, there are all kinds of connotations that are connected with this. It's certainly not positive. Fallen from where? But doesn't mean one is dead. As I said, this is a different type of metaphor, but one still has to arise. So that's takes part in interpretation. But also we have these experiential processes in which we apply to analyzing this image. We make analogies. We use empathy. And right, and then start interpreting through a process like this, schematically. That even if we didn't know the fallen X metaphoreme, you would still interpret it. But if you do, we would use that as well. Okay, so another advantage, and here you see a few famous faces. Some of them were shown earlier today, at least George Lakoff, I remember, that we try to present our approach to metaphor not so much as an alternative to any of these more famous theories, but as perhaps a way to help resolve some tension. So Cornelia Müller, for example, she emphasizes metaphoricity. That corresponds quite clearly to the situated level of the model. Metaphor not as a static entity or fixed unit, but as a dynamic form of meaning. Cameron and Dignan and their discourse metaphor theories kind of established the term metaphoreme, as far as I know, which combines specific lexical and grammatical form with specific conceptual content with specific affective value. This is what I was trying to get at with the fallen example. And just like morphemes, phonemes, they're relatively stable, right? And then at the bottom, we have these pan-human processes such as cross-domain mappings, image schemas, etc., by Lakoff and Johnson. But on our take, these are not metaphors per se. These are just factors that can help motivate the use of metaphor on the situated level, right? You cannot have metaphor that is just in the body or in the mind, etc. A metaphor has to be used. There has to be an expression. So our latest published, at least, definition of metaphor is it involves the use of a sign, possibly composite sign, just like fallen leaves, image and word, in one or more semiotic systems, where we have at least two different potential interpretations. Fallen, right? What kind of fallen? Is said literally fallen or figuratively fallen, and which of the figurative fallen kinds? And that implies some kind of tension. You start working, okay, thinking, and there has to be some kind of even very schematic, iconic resemblance relation between the meanings. Fallen, literally from top to down. Fallen in the metaphorical extended sense still implies a transition from one state to another, and typically, the initial state will be a better state than the latter one. One is more irrelevant in the context, or could be, that's another way of saying what seems to be intended, what is meant here by the author or by the artist or by the creator. And the other is understood by comparison with a less relevant, implying some directionality. Again, we try to avoid the more basic, the more extended, not to make the definition kind of circular here, just to find other criteria for what the senses are. And here are some references that where we have this. Okay, real world example from a concert. I like to take photographs when I go out. So I went to this concert by Roger Waters in Stockholm, and he polysemiotically he's a former member of the group Pink Floyd that many of you know, especially older generation, one of the classic rock groups. So when he was performing Animals, a famous Pink Floyd song, he also concluded with Trump is a pig. Right, so how do we analyze this with the help of the model? Trump is a pig. Well, again, two more or less conventionalized meaning in English of a pig. One is the more direct, literal one. The other, we talked about some belligerent, greedy, typically male person. You can say, what's the similarity between the two? Well, the similarity is not literal. The similarity is imposed by the cultural stereotypes that pigs display greed and low degrees of empathy. So when you have resemblance and analogy between the two, and and directionally of transfer one to the other, this will be based on these that shared cultural knowledge. I guess this used to be said very much in cognitive linguistic context. A metaphor is not just based on pre-existing similarities. This is why Lakoff and others didn't like notions of similarity, but they have to be, in part, creates the similarity. And this is not incompatible with what I'm saying. So yes, the metaphor is helping create the similarities, but also it's more than that. It's also implying the asymmetry, the tension, and involving some degree of creativity, even if it's something as conventional as a pig. Okay, this now let's start moving towards how we integrate this with metonymy. And I promised at the beginning to quote Roman Jakobson. This is from a very important paper of his called Quest for the Essence of Language, 1965. You may know that he's one of those who introduced the notion of iconicity to linguistics long before cognitive linguistics, was established in the 80s, 90s. So kind of after the Second World War, he did so. And he did that by referring to Peirce. He's one of the first linguists who struggled by understanding the American philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce, and one of the fathers of semiotics. Here, what is Jakobson saying? That there have to be a hierarchy of two meanings, one is more primary, central, proper, context-free. Maybe we shouldn't take these literally. Nothing is fully context-free, right? So here before, the one on the right on the screen, that's the most primary context-free. But again, pig, what kind of pig? And then the secondary is more marginal, figurative, transferred, contextual, and a characteristic feature of such asymmetrical couples. The metaphor, and he says, or metonymy, is an assignment of a signans. This is his term for expression, right? To a secondary signatum. This is his term, is using a Latin term for meaning, associated by similarity or contiguity with a primary meaning, right? So the similarity or contiguity is not between the expression and the meaning, or what is sometimes called form and content, though I don't like this use of form, because there's form also on the meaning level. But there is a similarity is between the meanings, right? So pig is the signans, and we have two different signata, signatums. The one is the actual pig, and the other is the extended sense. So this is our latest proposed definition. Again, yet unpublished. We're still tinkering with it, but one advantage is that it simplifies the one I gave before, and also is parallel to metaphor and metonymy. So there has to be an active sign use invoking one or more semiotic systems. That's like before, where the intended meaning, that was the relevant meaning. Now we can bite the bullet and say, well, the author intends something. What is relevant is most often likely what the author meant, even though we can always debate about what is meant. But in most cases, it is what is relevant. And it is understood through one another more directly represented meaning. Remember the actual pig versus the metaphorical one, which it resembles, albeit in a very schematic manner, or which it does not resemble, but is rather related to it in a part, whole, or contiguity-based relationship. It has to be iconicity in the case of metaphor, and contiguity. And how exactly to interpret contiguity, this is also debatable, but we'll take a fairly literal take that the contiguity has to be really in space-time. The two meanings have to have occurred not in the mind. So it's not a cognitive contiguity as many people define in cognitive linguistics. There has to be in perception or in memory, the two must have occurred together. Now, given this definition, we can start constraining, and hopefully not over constraining, but at least this is remain to be seen. So, as I already said before, the classical conceptual metaphors, Lakoff Johnson, are according to this definition not metaphors, right? Why not? Because there's no expression. It's just a cross-domain mapping of structure from one source domain to another, and they have to be different kinds. We can discuss still what exactly is a cross-domain mapping, what is a domain, what are the criteria. But remember, these kind of phenomena for us would be on the lowest embodied level. They're not metaphors per se. They're, in the best case, motivations for the use of metaphors. So we kind of turn things around compared to what most people in using CMT, conceptual metaphor theory, do. They place a lot of emphasis on the mappings, written with capital letters, and the actual linguistic metaphors are just linguistic manifestations of these. For us, there has to be a linguistic manifestation, or else it's not a metaphor. Right? It cannot be just a process in the mind brain. So here is an example here from Radford Edwards some years ago. An argument is a journey. It's fine, you can make these mappings that people have been doing for, well, 40 years in CMT for metaphors we live by. But this is a diagram. This is not a metaphor. My former colleague, Sonesson, says, well, it's a diagram because it schematically, analogically relates to things. And it conforms to the definition of a diagram. We have a label, an argument is a journey. And the actual metaphors are phrases such as what is the next step in the argument, what are your premises, the way of reasoning leads to a dead end, and so on. So these and the one in boldface are the ones that we can analyze and apply operational definitions to. Are there really two different meanings? Do they stand in the relationship of iconicity or contiguity? And so again, this is a line that I won't have time to go to the actual operationalization of the definition and how to study metaphors in anxiety versus stress, for example. And the primary metaphors, such as affection is warmth, which is why across many cultures people talk about, a warm person. Of course, there are cross-cultural differences, so maybe, and there are differences between warm and hot, and so, but in general, affection is warmth is a correlation in experience that is not a metaphor, but it can motivate the actual metaphors in language, gesture, and depiction. Happy is up, intimacy is closeness, and so on. So, and to the extent that they indeed correspond to these, what we call pan-human, if you have not used the term, that means common to all human beings, right? It's not pan. In the Latin, pan can mean chimpanzee, so it's not anything chimpanzee human. It's more or less the same as when we say universal, but universal is even stronger because they're why limited to human beings. What about cognition as such or consciousness as such? So this is saying we're on a relative attending this class, for example. They would be candidates for structured process on the embodied level, serving to motivate metaphors such as he is such a warm person. Okay. Now, okay, on we go on a more nitty-gritty level, remember that there has to be some ambiguity for there to be metaphor. But here we have ambiguity in a classical homonymy type. He put all his money in the riverbank, and where did he put it? In the actual bank or in the riverbank? The riverbank, the one I was showing you a picture of. Some people could hide their money there as well. Well, yes, but the two meanings here are not linked by iconicity. I guess you can always find some iconicity. Or Gerards, 1992, wrote a nice paper in cognitive linguistics, polysemies, puzzles, vagueness, vagaries, says that the distinction between ambiguity and generality is not as stable. You can make this even into a metaphor by context, but in general, it's not. So yes, 93, a single general meaning, not polysemy. And how would you do that? Gerrits mentioned several tests. They're not 100% foolproof, but one of them is you can say X but not X without a contradiction. So if you can say, but here you're far, I put it in the bank but not in the bank. No contradiction. This is a good test that this is a matter of ambiguity. On the other hand, you can say you're far away from the truth, but not far. You're far away, but not far away from the truth. To many native English speakers, sounds odd, if not contradictory, because you can kind of hard to say you're far away epistemically, but not far away spatially from the truth. So that cases in which the meanings are question of ambiguity, I'm sorry, generality rather than ambiguity, again, it would not fulfill the distinction because you don't have different meanings, you have different facets of the same meaning. This would be more relevant when we come to metonymy in a few minutes. Okay, so you probably know these famous people who have written extensively on metonymy, much more than I have, and I apologize in advance if I say something that is may sound too critical. It's not meant to be. It's just that from our perspective, what some of the things that they analyze as metonymies end up as non-metonymies. And so here is the perhaps most common definition of metonymy in the literature. If cross-domain mapping is the common metaphor, metonymy is a process which one conceptual entity, the vehicle, provides mental access to another conceptual entity, the target, within the same domain or idealized cognitive model. But again, notice that this cannot be metonymy for us because there are no expressions. We're still just talking only about processes in the mind. Here's one of the classic things from the literature. So, okay, the violin as such is contiguous with the player, the violinist, and because of this, we can have expressions such as the first violin has the flu, she cannot practice today. So we have these associations in experience that are not metaphors, but they motivate, I'm sorry, metonymies per se, because you see soon that unless we make this constraint, the notion of metonymy will explode, because contiguities in experience are everywhere. I mean, this is how we perceive, this is how we remember, this is how we think all the time in terms of contiguities. It's even more basic than similarity. So metonymy becomes the sign use itself that is grounded on the embodied level of some associations of experience. And two metonymy scholars that are very active in this figurativity and conference series, Berder Szabo and Berder, wrote in 2 years ago something that we fully agree with. That it is true that metonymy is ubiquitous, probably more prevalent than metaphor, but we would not have just the zillions metonymies around us, which is okay, but the square or the cube of the zillions. My mathematics is not good enough to imagine what a cube of zillions would be. But we take them at face value. In our attempt to define, we mentioned that for something to count as metonymy, it must be used as an element in a science system, ultimately mean that it must be intentional. And this is not so controversial. Here's another, Ron Langenker's definition of metonymy back in Introduction to Cognitive Grammar. So the vehicle, right, it cannot be something just mental. I mean, without expression, without the level of expression, without there being a sign. It is what he says here is the entity that is normally designated by metonymic expression serves as a reference point affording mental access to the desired target, the entity actually being referred to. Right? So go back, the vehicle has to appear as a linguistic sign, violin or image or a gesture, but there has to be an expression for the vehicle for metonymy to start working. And because of this, okay, we can skip all other cases in which we have purely conceptual metonymies. But here are some cases that are candidates for metonymy, but they don't meet the definition because we don't have two different meanings. We do not have polysemy, rather that we seem to have generality. So the milk tipped over, well, we seem to have a content for container, right? So it's the milk container tipped over, right? But it's we're using the content for it. He drank the whole bottle. Well, hopefully he didn't drink the container, but he drank the content in this case. Or breaking the window. Well, most likely what is broken by a stone, or etc., is the window glass, not the pane or the frame. But if you use another test for polysemy versus generality mentioned in that Gerard's paper from '93 that I was mentioning, it's called identity of sense anaphora. So if you can use an anaphora like in 4 prime, the milk tipped over and it spilled all over the table. Notice this is an indication. Now we're going from the container, the carton that spilled, to the content, it. And you don't notice any zeugma, don't know anything strange about it. This is indication that we don't have really from one to the other step, as is in characteristic metonymy, but you have a general notion that includes content and container. This is why most people don't notice these as metonymies. Again, someone who drank the whole bottle and then smashed it on the floor, you have a similar phenomenon, right? You're drinking the contents and then smashed the container. If there was two distinct meanings, there would be a zeugma effect, such as, to give an example, when we have distinct meanings. I cut the grass and my wife a class, meaning that in the first case, that's the literal cutting, and in the second is a metaphor like cutting classes. You find, oh, this is a word play with two different meanings, clearly polysemy. So then you do I think you see the general point. And finally, also why breaking the window that was recently painted, again, glasses versus frame. So according to this proposal, why not metonymy? Because we do not have the condition of having two distinct meanings. Also, other things that have been proposed as metonymy fall as non-metonymies according to this more constrained definition, because we may have contiguity, but as I suggested before, this is contiguity in mind, contiguity in categorization, or so, not contiguity in the world, in perception. Or so synecdoche, understood by Seto and Bierżwajonek, a Polish cognitive linguist with a difficult name. So if you say 7, she took the pill, what is meant is that she used in this context a birth control pill. So you have something more general for something more specific. So if you put them in a diagram, they would look like we have contiguity here. But this diagram is not in the world. This is to say, this is a diagram that is intentional rather than extensional, as logicians would say. Panther and Thomberg, who also work on metonymy, have tried to extend it in various cases. For example, they talk about predicational metonymy. He had to leave. Suggest there's kind of an implicature that he left. Right? He had to leave is a polite way of saying that he left. Well, yes, there is some kind of closeness, but this is semantic closeness rather than two different events that are spatio-temporally close in the world. And another of their cases, I will be brief, I promise to be brief. An attribute of a speech act can stand for the speech. Like, notice it gets even more intentional, right? It's the similarity, the contiguity is between the meanings and the pragmatics rather than between things that can be observed. Okay, let's give some clear examples that do fulfill the criteria for metonymy. Here are some classical cases. Well, Pyongyang carried out a nuclear test. Okay, sedimented, motivated capital for government. You know, it's standard across many languages, if not all nowadays. You can use a capital to stand for the government, and it fulfilled some of the other definitions. Pyongyang, you know, not the city, but the North Korean government, and so the museum has many monets. Well, hopefully not many French people with the name Monet, but actually artworks by the name Monet. They're looking for some hands. Well, not just the hands, but the people they belong to. And also here are some more creative. Notice those innovative metonymies. Well, they were innovative when Nürnberg and Panther came up with them, like the first violin has the flu that I gave before from 1999. By now, they've appeared in so many textbooks, so you can say they have been conventionalized, they have been sedimented. But the first time you can utter metonymy on the situated level could be embodied could be motivated by processes on the embodied level. And this is how in that other work we try to operationalize more innovative versus more conventionalized metaphors. And the same way we would do it for metonymies. Those, if the motivation by the embodied level is stronger than the motivation from the sedimented, then it's more innovative. If it's stronger from the sedimented than the embodied, then it's more conventionalized. So again, an example here. So the red bike is coming at 6 p.m. I kind of came up this not very conventional expression, and I'm using it to refer to the owner. Right? So I don't mean that the bike is coming by itself, but whoever is, and we know, and my interlocutor knows which red bike I mean, and can associate it with the owner. So based on perceiving the color red, being able to make analogy and contiguity-based inferences, people can understand it. And also a kind of frame object for owner that just like with metaphoremes have been sedimented on the middle level. Okay, let's finish off with a few examples from metaphor and metonymy and images, and I'm taking them from political discourse. Here is the during the crisis, the economic crisis in Greece. There were most of the graffiti street art was political. Almost by definition, street art is political. And here you see how the street artists are intermixing or blending the toilet paper and the Greek flag. And we have what? Again, a metonymic relation between the Greek flag and Greece. So all these kind of so-called symbols in the popular literature, that are conventionally associated. We know that the flag is conventionally associated with a nation state, etc. Well, this is contiguity, right? It's in the real world, we know that this flag is associated with a particular country in all kinds of ceremonies, like the Olympic Games, etc., etc. Toilet paper, well, yes, semi-conventionalized. For many of us, it has a pretty negative association. But when I lived in Thailand for some time, a toilet flag can be also used on the table in a nice box as a tissue. So, yes, it's semi-conventionalized, I guess you can say for that. If you come from a culture where toilet paper is also used for nicer things, you wouldn't have the same interpretation. So based on these metonymies, you can get the metaphor grease is crap, which is fairly innovative, at least in the way it's being expressed here. So you see almost kind of inference making. Metonymy always a precondition. Here is an image from the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Russia against Ukraine. So you have to know that this is not the Russian state flag, but it's the Russian Navy flag, and it's metonymically associated with Russia, Russian Federation, conventionalized, or at least semi-conventionalized. If we didn't know that, I didn't know that, so I had to look it up. Why this flag? It semi-conventionalized that this is a way to represent Ukrainian folk dress with the long hair also, and some of the colors are also there, blue, yellow, and blue. Could help you understand that this is not just any woman, but this is a woman in Ukrainian dress that goes to Ukraine. And a detail that was actually pointed to me out by Polish and Ukrainian audiences that I had missed. You know this thing? I forgot the name. It's called a baker rod. When you make bread or pizza or something, you use that. And it's traditional societies, it was women who would be doing that. And if you don't have any other defense weapon, when a bully comes in, typically male, you use this to defend yourself against the bully. So yes, the baker rod is associated, unfortunately, in space-time with female defense against male violence. So what's the resulting metaphor? That Ukraine is a strong and brave woman facing the Russian aggressors, but unfortunately and ironically, I guess you can say, underarmed. Here is another more recent pictorial metaphor when the invasion became full scale and whole cities were like Kharkiv and Zaporizhia were leveled. So here we have the Ukrainian flag, again, as a metonymically standing to help situate it geographically, that this is about Ukraine. We have a shelter that metaphorically, why? Because it's similarity-based, representing a heart. So a heart has become a shelter. And you see there are two figures here, or that look like a parent and a child. That are in that shelter. The heart has become this giant person, right? The heart belongs to someone. So you need a second metonymic step. Whose heart is this? And you're led kind of metaphoric that it's the heart of the fatherland who is defending the family this way. So as metaphor and metonymy are closely interlinked, and much more work is some of it is ongoing under the heading of multimodality by Charles Forceville and others, of multimodal metaphor, but a lot of it still needs to be done. Here's a kind of a last example, and why it's the one I had at the beginning when I started, and it's more complex than meets the eye. Right? So we have the cross, and the cross is conventionally associated with Jesus Christ, Christianity. So that means that it's easiest to see the sunflower as Jesus, Christ in passion, as it's properly said. Right? And since the sunflower is the national flower of Ukraine, then you get the metaphor that Ukraine is Jesus in passion. Right? So it's Ukraine has been crucified. But this is just one interpretation. This is the first one, and again, why we need multiple perspectives and voices. So again, when I discussed this with my Ukrainian audience there, they said, wait, it's more complex than this. You need common knowledge as to enter the premises in order to understand a complex metaphor like this. So we can start like before, that the cross is metonymic for Jesus. The sunflower is a kind of metaphorical Jesus. Why metaphor? Because it's the similarity is. But when you look at the ribbon here, you see Z being shown twice. And that it's not as in public consciousness as it was 2.5 years ago. You may remember Z, Z, Z everyone. But what did Z represent? Well, that was the Russian invasion. So most of those forces had Z, and then people would who were for the Russian invasion would be making the letter Z everywhere, and vice versa. So somehow Z here actually is contextualizing this is not the Ukrainians, but rather the invaders. And here's the common knowledge. So there is a real world, I checked it up and found the videos of an old woman giving sunflower seeds to Russian soldiers. And she told them, put these seeds in your pockets so that when you die, at least something good will happen. Sunflowers would come out from the ground. So very different interpretations. So this implies that she was telling them that they will die. And this is a kind of support from this. It's a Russian cartoonist who writes the translation is, and they told you not on but in Ukraine. I don't know if you know, but you can show your attitudes towards the war with one preposition if you speak Russian. If you say na Ukraini or v Ukraini. If you say na, you're treating Ukraine as a place, and implicitly a Russian belonging place. But if you say v in, you means that's in a different country. So you're in Ukraine, and this is why the author here is saying that and of course it's an extra level of metaphor. The v means not just in the country of Ukraine, but in the land of Ukraine. So this supports that letter interpretation that I told you. Okay, so I promised for about 1 hour and my 1 hour is running out. We can let me have a few slides of summary, and then we can discuss. Cognitive semiotics is overlaps with cognitive linguistics, but by also engaging and introducing concepts and methods from semiotics and cognitive science and phenomenology. And phenomenology, I mean Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, Dan Zahavi, Sean Gallagher, etc., gives a slightly different perspective on phenomena that you are including, like those metaphor and metonymy. Something that, irrespective of where we identify with cognitive semiotics or linguistics or so, we need well-motivated theoretical definitions and operational ones with good translation validity. This is what, remember, translation validity is between the theoretical and the operational. And what we here have proposed is relatively constrained definitions of metaphor and metonymy. This can help this inflation of zillions upon zillions, Barder and Barder-Chabot, especially when we go beyond language, because their meaning making is so complex and ambiguous, and without this constraint, I mean, it's one thing is to discuss what an image like the one I showed you before, what it means for the author, for the audience, in the context. That's hard enough, but it's even harder to provide a systematic theoretical analysis, as I attempted a bit to do with some degree of validity, right? Claiming validity rather than just, oh, this is just my interpretation. So similar to the verbal or linguistic metonymies, these pictorial metonymies differ with respect to conventionality. That is the degree of motivation from the sedimented level. Right? So when this is how we theoretically defined conventionality, if it's more motivated by the sedimented. Many of these visual symbols, such as national flags, national flowers, letters, function as conventionalized or semi-conventionalized metonymies. They help you pinpoint, right? And this is why they're used so often in political cartoons. That helps you constrain the interpretation. This is who we're referring to versus that. Others are more innovative. Metaphonymy, first used by Goossens, and since that implies that metaphor and metonymy are interlinked. And the term is fine, but it kind of implies that it's an odd one, that combining the two requires a special term. What we would say is that since they interact all the time in discourse and the situated level, in language, pictures, etc., Metonymy should be reserved maybe for some very special cases in which it's kind of hard to even determine whether something is predominantly a metaphor or metonymy. And finally, this extensive interactions between metaphor, metonymy, and polymic imagery can give rise to, yes, multiple interpretations. And notice that this can be a communicative resource. If we didn't have this ambiguity, there was probably, then it would be kind of boring, right? And you can use this ambiguity as used by artists and poets and others for communicative effects. So I want to thank my colleagues at the Division for Cognitive Semiotics at Lund for helping to develop this field of cognitive semiotics. Audiences in Rzeszów that I mentioned, Prague, yes, I also gave a version of this at a summer school in semiotics in Czechia, in Lviv in Ukraine, Shanghai, and for comments on this earlier version that I've hopefully accommodated some. And to all of you for your attention and interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Zlatev, for your impressive lectures. And I really appreciate, because it's not so easy task to have a 1 hour long speech with code. I know it's kind of uncomfortable. So thanks, Professor Jordan Zlatev, for today's lectures, and in which he first provided an introduction of cognitive semiotics, which is a new field that combining linguistics, cognitive science, and semiotics with the help of phenomenology. And then he moved on to the motivation and sedimentation model, the MS. And I really appreciate your metaphors that combine the layers in MSM models to the geological layers. And it's really explaining the term used in here. And further, he provides how we analyze metaphor and metonymy in MSM, and also a few examples that how to analyze them. And I believe you have already made a perfect conclusion of your speech. So let's move on to the discussion part. I have already seen some people has, and in addition, so here in Zoom, we have up to 90 audience, and now it's 75. And in another platform, the Tencent meeting, we have up to 100 audience, so it's a totally up to 200 audience. And let's deal with the audience questions in Zoom first. So if anyone have question and want to discuss with Professor Zlatev, just open the microphone and video. You are highly encouraged to open the cameras. And so let's see what question we have here.
I'm seeing one from about polysemy, different meanings, right? And I think it's not just English, right? It's not controversial that polysemy is a universal property of language. All languages, for all languages, many, if not most words, have multiple meanings. Right? So and it's hard to define sometimes how many, right? I think the question here was on Zoom by Tencent meeting, right? In addition to the basic meaning of literal meaning of a word in English, other meaning is metaphorical meaning, metonymic meaning. In addition to 3 meanings, there is 4th. So what I'm saying is, no, we don't have to decide how many meanings there are. What we have to decide is establish that there are. And notice we used interpretation in the meaning, in the definition, because meaning applies for pig. Okay, if you have, let's say, the pejorative sense of pig in the dictionary, that's relatively easy, right? You find this extended sense in the dictionary, and you say we have 2 different meanings. But in some cases, especially for metonymy, let's say my made-up example of the red bike is coming at 6 o'clock. You won't have a meeting. Red bike stands for Professor Sonneson or something like that. No, you'd have to understand by context what the two different interpretations are. And following Jacobson, what we say, if the connection between those two interpretations is mostly based on similarity, then it's a metaphor. If the step from one to the other is based on spatial-temporal contiguity, it's a metonymy. And sometimes you have both of these, so it's kind of hard to decide if it's mostly one or the other, and those could be metaphonymies. But I can take more questions, and maybe people can indeed open their videos. It'll be easier to understand. I have okay. As people, I'm answering the next one. What is the difference between phenomenology and Lakoff and Johnson? So Lakoff and Johnson, the early work, 1980 especially, was indeed inspired by phenomenology to some degree, especially Merleau-Ponty. There are passages in which they say post-Husserlian phenomenology that it emphasized bodily experience and so. Unfortunately, Lakoff and maybe more Lakoff than Johnson goes eventually with neural theory of metaphor, etc., which is the opposite of phenomenology. The basic principle of phenomenology is every claim has to be groundable in direct experience. Right? You do not assume anything that you cannot experience. So you don't assume anything on the basis of authority, or even on logic. You have to. This is called the first principle, the principle of intuition. So, and there are various kinds of phenomenology. Some are more, historical, like Heideggerian. Some are more towards natural science, like Merleau-Ponty. But all agree on that phenomenology is a type of philosophy that wants to ground all statements in direct experience. And yeah, that maybe that's a pretty strong generalization, but there are people in cognitive linguistics that are closer to phenomenology. Ad Folen, for example, who you mentioned is part of the review editor of your journal, is very sympathetic to phenomenology and to cognitive semiotics. And by the way, he's working now with the motivation and sedimentation model as well, suggesting some amendments, including having sedimentation going all the way down to the embodied level, right? Allowing some degree of conventionality even in the embodied. And we're still discussing how to allow both, maybe splitting the embodied level in one that is universal and one that could be culture specific. So again, I don't want to make a strict divisions, both between cognitive semiotics and cognitive linguistics, between phenomenology and between experientialism. I have a paper 2010 called Cognitive Linguistics and Phenomenology, published in Handbook on Cognitive Science and Cognitive Science and Phenomenology. So you could find that paper if you want like a longer answer in which I answer the question why Lakoff and Johnson are not true phenomenologists. But again, this was written 14 years ago, and I'm looking back, I was a bit too critical back then. I was still kind of angry at some cognitive linguists for going, as I said now, in a reductionist mode. And what does that mean? That means when you kind of give up on experientialism and want to account for meaning, language, etc., in terms of this principle that I mentioned, intuition, versus want to account for it in terms of causal mechanisms, such as mirror neurons, mappings across visual cortex, and etc. This is definitely far away from both experientialism and phenomenology. There's one more question, and then the floor is open for ones from the audience. Thank you, Professor Zlatev. Many misunderstandings have been led by internet emojis used by different generations. Examples like is the smiley emoji used by groups of people in the generation after roughly 18 means anger. Well, it means politeness, and by people in age, can this approach help to integrate a different meaning of emojis in different age groups and explain the variation between different generations? Very good questions. And also that shows that there's so much conventionality about emojis, right? So yes, the simple answer would be, okay, iconicity, they resemble a smiling face. Smiles, there is, of course, cross-cultural variation in how people smile across cultures in different contexts. But there is something universal. Many people say the spontaneous smile from almost newborn children is connected to pleasure. But this kind of universal ground becomes instantiated, manifested in very different ways. Would be on the situated level when you actually smile. Things about ironic smiles and so on. And now we have not just a smile, but we have a sign that conventionally resembles a smile. And these would come with some specific conventional sedimented meanings. So yes, misunderstandings will come either by people having different conventions for these, right? One is politeness, the other is the other, and other may simply not know them, have very little knowledge, and they will be forced to interpret it based on the embodied level. And how would be the embodied? Oh, this is a smile. Smile is typically someone happy, glad. It must mean somebody's happy. So yes, we haven't worked on emojis, but it's a fascinating object and it's being used all the time. So, but again, if I follow, we would have to do a corpus and look at the situated use of emojis in different contexts to discern some patterns and see how they're related and motivated by the embodied and sedimented levels. Okay, that was the last question in the chat. Any other ones? There are some more in Chinese, but I cannot read them, unfortunately. Okay.
Yes, thank you, Professor Zlatev. It looks like we have a new questions here in the chat box.
There is one about sedimented cognitive schema. Schema, the notion of schema is difficult, and the term is quite ambiguous. When I was referring it, I was mentioning Bartlett, 1932, Remembering, when he talks about different schemas and that are culture specific. So he was giving examples of, let's say, a drawing that is ambiguous between an owl and a cat, and how somebody from one culture saw this as a cat, right? While others as an owl. So previous experience would affect perception, right? I guess this is kind of and this will be common to, but notice we have image schemas in cognitive linguistic theory that are supposed to be universal, right? Like the containment schema or the balance schema, etc. This is very different, and so that they or something corresponding to image schemas would belong to the embodied level, as we said, to the extent that they are panhuman. Then those more culture-specific one would belong to the sedimented level. Now, how we want to implement them, you said here, whether we have computational or others, that's another question. I am, as you may know, for me, the term computational always brings a red flag, because it's one thing to implement many of these ideas in computational systems, including presently popular AI systems, large language models, and etc. But it's another thing to claim that we are such computational systems, that when we understand, when we interpret, we're computing. I think that's a metaphor, and a not a very good metaphor. That the mind is a computer. We're not computing, right? We're perceiving, we're embodied beings, interpretative beings, etc. Computation is a tool that we have created, and then we go back and apply this tool for better and worse, for some practical tool purposes. But as we know, we end up interpreting ourselves in terms of the tools that we create. And I think information processing and computing, etc., is a misleading metaphor applied to actual meaning making. I was going to say human meaning making, but also animal meaning making, the kind of studying. We're not. So this is why I would not say it's a computational frame. Shall I continue with the chat? Some are appearing as I'm answering. Okay. Innovative metaphors can be created through the phenomenon of false friends. For example, library in English means a place where people borrow and read books, but in French, libraire, a place to buy books. Okay, such examples can be prevalent across languages. So this phenomenon influence the procedures of metaphor and metonymy and bring more possibility. Thank you. Very good. And I think it's a good practical question. I think I'm on the periphery of translation studies, but when I've looked at the metaphors and translating and mistranslating, that could be one way in which innovative metaphors appear through bilingualism. As I have, some of my colleagues were saying that they were using the metaphor cooked, and they came from one was Italian and the other was Russian, and they share a room, and one of them says to the other, "Oh, I'm cooked now after so much time working here." And they understood each other quite well because there was something quite conventional in both languages that cooked means tired, right? Exhausted, but it's not conventional for English, right? So when we heard that, right? Oh, I'm feeling quite cooked now. I don't know if you're feeling cooked now. I'm a bit slightly cooked after 1.5 hours. Well, that's quite innovative. Not very original, but yeah, that means we have to, and people can maybe. So that's the point. So we are always interpreting metaphors by this, what we place in the embodied level, and analogy making, interpretation. So what could cooked mean? Well, some kind of interpretation is made, and then you can test it. You can say, okay, is this how you understand it? Okay. Another here, more linguistic example than English exocentric compounds. Some scholars argue that exocentric nouns such as redneck, loudmouth, graybeard, pickpocket, cutthroat, they're clearly compounds. I have to remember why they're exocentric, but okay, they can also be interpreted as metaphoric and metonymically endocentric, rather than. I think I need some help here, because I cannot remember the distinction here between exocentric and endocentric and how that would. Can the questioner or somebody else help me?
Yes, our questioner Mong Jack have sent a new message in the chat box. If you see below, they are extracentric because the semantic head is outside its two components. He explained the term like that.
Yes, so redneck, loudmouth, gray beard. The head would be the second element, right? Mouth, beard, neck.
Yeah, so I also understand it this way, so I'm a little confused why he called it is outside its two components.
Maybe if we can see like two different interpretations. So you're saying that some of these phrases can be interpreted different ways, right? A loud mouth, is a person with a loud mouth. So this is clearly a metonymy, right? So or at least I would say metonymy dominates. A gray beard is a person with a gray beard, a red neck, a person with a red neck, etc. But of course, it's more than that. So you mean this extra meaning that a redneck is not just the person of a great redneck, but it's a person from the countryside with low education or so. Do we have the possibility of somebody actually opening their video and asking the question live? Or you don't have that option in the system?
Yeah, I think they can do that. Celia, we can encourage the audience to turn on the video.
Yes, I think the Zoom system can allow us to do this.
Hello, Jack. So can you help? You can explain to us this the different interpretations of these phrases, like cutthroat and graybeard, but we cannot hear you. You don't seem to be muted, but I don't hear anything. Did you enter with sound when you entered Zoom? You know, you have to click enter with sound, otherwise it doesn't appear.
宇航，你检查一下给没给权限？
Sorry, let's check about the setting of the
Okay.
Zoom meeting.
Okay, I'll take the next question in the meantime before we come back to the exocentric and endocentric interpretations. It's very interesting, but I think it requires more detail. So then we have how does interplay between bodily experience and linguistic expression shape the understanding and use of metaphors in everyday communication from the perspective of semiotics? Right, it is quite broad. So examples are always necessary to make such questions more specific. But first, a broad answer is that I mean, look at all the metaphors that we come up. Some of them are reused from the literature, and it's hard to say how much bodily experience is involved there. But when you are studying languaging or actual communication, especially using the body as well, then it becomes much more concrete, and you find distinctions such as the ones I was describing now, in which the relations, let's say, between the body and notice one thing, when we talk about the embodied level, we use kind of capital E to distinguish it from the everyday sense of the body, just somehow involving the body, let's say in gesturing or so, or many of the technical notions of embodiment that you have in the literature, including neural embodiment or cognitive unconscious embodiment and etc. So remember that the embodied level used to be called the universal level in Crusadio's framework. So even in our first publications, it was still said to be the universal level. So that means that we're going to look for capacities that are in principle shared. So let's say, okay, to simplify, let's say something like image schemas, Lakoff Johnson style, are pan-human and belonging to the universal level. Right? So let's say you have a polysemiotic, a language and gesture expression in which a politician is talking about rising inflation, right? Or some of my students were looking at some of these cases. So if you understand rising inflation, I mean, you can understand that inflation is rising without any gesture at all. I mean, it's conventionally means increasing, right? But if you also analyze the gesture, it will matter if you presented the gesture like this, rising inflation, then you are taking a detached, what McNeil will call an observer viewpoint, right? Or so you are doing a kind of a gestural diagram. But if you're talking about rising inflation with a gesture like this, then there's some agency. You can start thinking that the politician is kind of embodying, the market or whoever is, rising inflation, who is behind it. So it's a different analysis you would make. And I would say spontaneously, this is the one that is less motivated by the embodied level. This is the one that is more so. And if you can operationalize these degrees, you can even think of degrees of metaphoricity, right? So what we're trying to say in some of our studies that the more the expression is motivated by the embodied level, the more alive, right? The more metaphoric. It's hard to speak in non-metaphorical terms about different kinds of metaphors. So this is a spontaneous answer. I mean, you're right. In a way, it's a truism, right? That there will be an interrelation between the bodily pan-human and the linguistic. We have to make it much more specific, and I think looking for distinctions, differences between different degrees of metaphoricity, different kinds of gestures, use or non-use of gestures, whether the gestures would express the source or the target domain concept, etc., are relevant for analysis. But a final point I would say this, I mentioned already computation and large language models and AI. I mean, what follows from this model that is, again, based on phenomenology and so is that there cannot be truly meaningful language used without the embodied level. If you short circuit the embodied language, you would have a simulation of language use, not true language use. Ergo, large language models, ChatGPT, etc., are not authentic language users. They are just simulations of language use. There is no intrinsic meaningfulness to AI-generated language. Okay? For many, this would be non-controversial. It will be, especially from cognitive linguistics, assuming embodiment, etc. But it's surprisingly controversial. Even when I presented this in Düsseldorf and gave it as a kind of a conclusion, many people said afterwards, "Oh, you're putting down our systems," or you're. And my response would be, we have to. This doesn't mean that it's not useful. That we can not make practical use of these kind of disembodied language systems, but we have to be aware what they are and their limitations. And I would urge like concrete practical studies on metaphor use by ChatGPT and so on. My prediction would be that there would be very bad at anything but very sedimented and conventionalized metaphors. If you try using both very creative, innovative metaphors to them, or if you look for any use of metaphor and innovative, you will not find it. I may be wrong, but at least, why so? Because their performance, as far as I understand it, is based just on corpora, right? On billion-word corpora and statistics, so in terms of the model, they still have that sedimented level in terms of structure and process. There's some kind of interaction with the user because you have some kind of adaptation in context learning, what they call, right? But they do lack, per definition, the embodied level. And if the embodied level is essential for genuine meaning, they will lack genuine meaning. So this will be one implication that is more principled. Okay, what do you think about the multi-level schema, domain, frame, mental space? Okay, is it similar? I've discussed with Zoltan at a few conferences. I think that there are similarities. Kind of our concerns are similar. That of kind of regimenting, right? Looking with kind of hierarchical models. Oh, now we can hear you, Jack. But just answer that last question.
Okay.
So, I'm answering the question about extended conceptual metaphor theory and the levels. Yes, it's rather. I'm glad you noticed that similarity. They were kind of independent developments, and I think we saw it in Tartu, Estonia, when he was presenting that and the kind of structured and having, but he has 4 levels, right? So from the most surface level, that would, I'm not sure what that would be. Would it be was schema the most basic for him? I think it was schema, domain, frame, mental space. Right? I think it was hierarchically organized like that, and some mental spaces. But in any case, I forget the details. But you have these either most concrete linguistic expressions, and you need some local mental spaces to interpret. But further down, you have much more basic and perhaps universal schemas. So I think even our theories are different. They were provoked by similar concerns of finding meaningfulness on these various levels, and to be able to talk about metaphors and interaction between these levels rather than, oh, metaphors are, cross-domain mappings structured by image schemas only, because also metaphors are concrete use of language in other semiotic systems. Okay, now, Jack, should we go back to the
Hi,
existential
Professor.
and the subject
Yeah,
matter?
yeah, I can explain in detail about my questions. So all the 6 examples that I gave are exocentric or metonymically endocentric, if you like. That is not the point. So my point is, for these 6 compounds, they can be divided into 2 groups. The first 3 is the first group. They are adjective plus noun compounds: red neck, loud mouth, and gray beard. And
Right.
these kind of compounds are relatively easier to be found. But for the second group, that is the last 3 examples that I gave, for example, pickpocket, cut throat, and spoil sport, they are verb plus noun compounds. They are relatively rarer to be found. So my question is, why this is the case? Why the adjective plus noun exocentric compounds are easier to be found? Is it because it is related to our bodily experience, to our body parts, to be more specific? For example, neck, mouth, beard, they are part of our body. But for the pickpocket, that means a thief who picks pocket of the passengers, for instance. That
Right.
scenario is not very easier to be found.
Right. And for you, whether they're metaphoric or metonymic is less important.
Yeah, less important. These 6 are all metonymically endocentric, I think, not metaphorically endocentric.
I would tend to agree, right? Because they refer all to people who have these properties. So that's contiguity, or within domain mapping, or however. Right? So, and then something. But your question is okay. It's more now I get it. It's more. I mean, specific for English. I don't know.
Yeah, for English only.
Yeah, I mean, one could. I can think a bit more about in my second language, Swedish here, whether there's a lot of compounds and whether it generalizes. My spontaneous feeling is that there is something. It has to do with a property noun, right? That it's more easy to make a property noun. A gray beard. Notice it is a beard that is gray, a neck that is red, whatever they mean, into a compound, and then use it metonymically. Well, a cutthroat is, or a pickpocket. It's not just a body part, it's the action, right? It's the
Yes, the action for the person.
Exactly. So it's one in the case it's like a property for a person. Here is an action for a person. And I mean, what would you say? Now I can see you. Okay, I can hear you. Maybe it's enough that I can hear you. Is that here's a very tentative suggestion that it's the metonymic jump from a property to a person is easier, right? The contiguity between property and a person possessing the property is easier to make, both in kind of conventionalizing. Let's say the first time these were used, right? They must have been used in a situated level without the help of the conventionalized. Then the other, when you have an action, a cutthroat. Why? because I mean, one thing is that thinking about in terms of Crofts model, two-dimensional about aspect and verbal meaning is that I mean, and adjectives are. I mean, the meanings of these adjectives are stative, right? If you are red, you stay red. If you're gray, or you change very slowly, right? So they're stative and more permanent. On the other hand, cutting a throat, apart that it's a terrible activity, it's relatively instantaneous, and it's I mean, it's one thing to characterize a person that here's a person with a gray beard or red. Here's a person who cuts throats. So you're making one activity. I don't know, who are you thinking about? I'm thinking of Sweeney Todd, you know, the barber, you know, who cuts throats. So somebody who for whom this has become such a, you know, such a customary activity that you characterize that person as a cutthroat. I don't know. Again, I'm speculating, but I'll think some more about it. And what I said, that it's one thing. I mean, it's idealized to think of a case of metonymy or metaphor that is so innovative that it's only motivated by the embodied level, right? That means by the analogy, by the association, by the perception, by in almost all cases, there will be co-motivation by the sedimented. What does that mean in that case? That means there will be a construction, right? A compound construction. We know that some languages, Germanic languages, have much more compounds than other languages. And so you would have like an adjective noun compound schema that is already on the sedimented level that would continue motivating the creation of new ones. A verb noun schema would be much less represented. And then why so? Well, the explanation that I gave you was a kind of speculated idea of why it became less sedimented to begin with, because it's, you know, verbs, actions are more instantaneous and harder to be reified, a nice word, right? To reify something specific into an object, which is what semantically a compound is.
Okay, I see your point. Thank you.
Exactly. This is the book that I was referring to. It has a nice two-dimensional model which distinguishes situation types, and they have actions, and, you know, the classical states, achievements, accomplishments. Instead of extending this with more and more types, he shows by 2 and then later 3 dimensions how you capture many of these distinctions. Okay, thank you for the question. And here is one more question, that if we can relate metonymy to syntactic research. Oh, this is a very general question. And again, I am a relative newcomer to metonymy, I have to say that. Let me be frank, I came to metonymy because of students wanted to work with metonymy. I had a Chinese student, I don't know if she's listening now, Di Wu, who stayed with us and as a guest PhD student, and she was asking very much how to extend our approach from metaphor to metonymy. And by extending it, automatically we had to adapt the definitions of metaphor as well. And again, maybe the kind of constrained definition of metonymy that I gave was too constrained, and I felt that, you know, we're coming in from the side and saying this is a metonymy, this is not a metonymy. This sounds, if not arrogant, at least like presumptuous, right? I'm not meaning to correct people like Rod and others, or Panther, who are using metonymy, let's say, for syntax. I think what wanted to say by, let's say, saying that there are a lot of monettes in a museum, is but that these kind of boring conventionalized metonymies, they more obviously fulfill the criterion of 2 different meanings, and that you get at the intended meaning, the relevant meaning, via the more basic but less relevant meaning. Right? Notice this is a bit like the way we want to restrict metaphor to cases in which you do find these two different meanings. What about cases in which you don't? When you go kind of instantaneously into the intended meaning, even though there is some kind of metonymic background, right? Let's say, I mean, syntactic semantic is what was Panther's example, and he had to leave implies or implicates that he left. Right? So yes, you can see something that resembles this classic case of metonymy, where you go from one meaning to another. But right, it's not that we have two events here. Like even like in a moment ago, when we're thinking about cutting throats and red beards and how they are associated with certain people. Here we have two different situation types. He had to leave, and semantically and grammatically distinct from he left. He left is an instantaneous achievement. He had to leave. Spectrally is more. I mean, literally, it's not saying that he actually left. That you're just stating something deontically that he was forced to leave. So, what I want to say is that we can start extending the prototypical case of metonymy, whether it's conventional, like artist for work or capital for government, or something more novel, like the ham sandwich was used first novel, and now it's not novel at all, right? The ham sandwich is wanting checks. This is why I made up the case of the red bicycle. But I feel that better than calling it metonymy and risking overextending the notion of metonymy, people have said, when I was kind of appalled by how many things were called metonymy in the literature when I entered 3-4 years ago with my student. And I felt this even more extended what people were calling metaphor. So maybe this is the closest answer I would say, that think about those what they share the phenomenon. So to do a cross-domain mapping means that you're performing analogy. So analogy making is universal pan-human phenomenon. Whether you're going to use this for metaphor, whether you're going to use this for some kind of blending or other, that would be another thing. So better look at what is common experientially, cognitively to these structures, and use that to help understand how a particular phenomenon, rather than taking these names like metaphor, metonymy, synecdoche, that are classically applied to figures, forms of sign use, and overextending them to apply them to so much else that risks overgeneralizing.
Okay, Professor Zlatev.
Yes.
Can I have a question?
Okay, is anybody asking a question?
Yes, I want to ask a question.
Yes, please do.
Well, my question is about the endocentric and exocentric. So, Professor, the big difference between the endocentric and exocentric is the head noun or the head word. For example, in endocentric, there is head noun available, so we can easily determine the overall meaning of a compound. But in exocentric, we don't have any head word. So that's why we have some troubles to interpret or determine the overall meaning of any compound. And just like one of my colleague, he gives some examples, and in his examples, he use all the words which are all the compounds which are exocentric, but some of the words like adjective plus noun, they give us a complete meaning, but they are exocentric. So a word or a compound which give us a complete meaning, and we determine overall meaning, but the compound is exocentric because there is no head word in that particular compound. So can we still categorize that compound in exocentric?
So cutthroat, that was the second type. is that still endocentric on your account?
Yes, cutthroat. Now it gave us a complete meaning, right? But it's in exocentric, it has no head word. So can we categorize an exocentric because it's give us a complete meaning? So then what's the difference between endocentric and exocentric? Because giving meaning is a complete interpretation of meaning is in endocentric, but it is still exocentric. So can we put this type of words, this type of compounds who don't have a complete or who don't have a head noun, but it give us a complete meaning, it determine of overall meaning. So we put such type of words in endocentric or exocentrics?
Thanks. You know, you and Jack also, if you want to send me an email with some more examples of each kind, I would think more about it. But to be frank, I admit that I'd never thought about endocentric versus exocentric compounds in relation to metaphors. Yeah, I've been wrecking my brain even to remember what would count as head in these cases. So I think we can agree that okay, the first kind, the adjective noun, they're what you call a more complete meaning, right? So I interpret redneck, graybeard. This is a property of an object, and is that endocentric?
No, it's exocentric because they don't have any head word. It's exocentric.
Why isn't beard the head word? Gray beard.
Yes.
That refers to
gray,
a person, not just beard.
yes,
Sorry?
beard.
Because that refers to a person with gray beard, not just refer to the beard.
Well, yes, well, it's a gray beard, but then this particular property becomes extended metonymically to the person. So I mean, just grammatically, I would say in gray beard, an adjective noun construction, the noun is the head, the adjective is the modifier. But then it becomes just like Monet painting is extended to the art of the person. Here is a more generic term that is extended to a person of a particular kind. And cutting throat is also means to be extended to a person who cuts throats. But it's I mean, so it's not a distinction between one of them being, to my mind, interpreted as end or exocentric. I mean, grammatically, we can decide. I mean, linguists, and I admit that my professorship is in general linguistics, but because for 10, 15 years I've been working mostly with semioticians and cognitive scientists, my interest in syntax and head and modifiers is rusty. And you see, my way of trying to explain things spontaneously would be not in terms of head modifier construction, etc., but rather in terms of the semantics of properties versus actions. Properties being more stable, actions being more dynamic and changeable. So I'm sorry I cannot help more than this for now. But again, if you would like to send me an email, jordan.zlatev@ling.lu.se. I have two emails. One is ling.lu.se. That's my linguistic professor. The other is semiotic plus lu.se. And they go to the same place. It just kind of corresponds to my double identity of both a linguist and a semiotician. Okay, we have 5 more minutes or so. Thomas, you had a question, it seemed, right?
Yeah, you have been in the field of cognitive linguistics for a long time, and you have done a substantial contribution to the field. What do you think is the developing trend for the study of metaphor and metonymy? The topic has been here for over 40 years since metaphor we live by. So there are so many publications on metaphor and metonymy, and every year and every conference, and what is the future? What is the direction?
Okay, thank you. It's a very general question. We were kind of asked something like this remember this special issue, Cognitive Linguistics 30 years later, 2012. You remember? There was a publication in Cognitive Linguistics that came out. Was it 2012 or 2014? Anyway, we were encouraged. I had a chapter there about cognitive linguistics and phenomenology. Actually, I would recommend that more than the other one I mentioned. It's called Turning Back to Experience in Cognitive Linguistics with the Help of Phenomenology. And kind of, they asked us, all contributors. So Croft had a chapter there, Langecker had a chapter, you know, all the big names. And I was wondering what I was doing there, because I don't consider myself a prototypical cognitive linguist. As I say, I enjoy cognitive linguistics, but I'm also more, you know, belong to those other fields. But anyway, so they were asked us to say where the field will go. Make kind of prediction for 20, 30 years. And it's very hard to make predictions, but I was saying things like at the end that some of the debates I've experienced when you have in a field are become like in-group debates. You know, they can appear from a broader perspective to be easily resolvable, but they become kind of artificially convoluted, you know, because of the concepts within a particular field. So having a broader perspective, may say, okay. So to answer your question, Thomas, this is, I know again, it's a bit presumptuous coming from the side, this is metaphor, this is metonymy, etc. But if you take a perspective like the one I suggested, one, put the axiom, there is no metaphor or metonymy without expression, right? So not to look for them in the head, or, you know, in the mind or whatever, but look to the way they are used in different, what we call semiotic systems. Other would call them modes or so. So look, the expression, is it in language, is it in gesture, is it in pictures? Then systematically study them. People already are there. Trying to establish various scales of conventionality. Let's say Gerrit Steen, for example, you know, he has this deliberate metaphor theory that they struggle to distinguish more or less deliberate metaphors. Instead of fighting, you know, this theory versus another theory, you know, DMT versus CMT, you know, metaphor wars, the way Gibbs wrote that book. Let's try to step back, and this is maybe what I've learned from semiotics. They've been around for a longer time. I'm not a true semiotician by saying, oh, you know, forget about linguistics. We have the real answers in Peirce. No, that's nonsense. It's not that there was some, you know, geniuses who wrote and solved everything for us. But by taking this kind of broader perspective with some historical, you start seeing some differences. And this is what I try to present today, right? That using this basic Jacobsonian schema, metaphor is on the side of similarity, metonymy is on the side of contiguity. It's very often not a matter of either or, but how they combine. The way they combine can differ depending on which one is more conventionalized. Right? Go ahead and study actual data. Study actual metaphor metonymy use across cultures, languages, semiotic systems. This is why I gave also these like pictorial metaphors, because you see we're kind of bombarded by them from media, and I still haven't gone over to, I mean, the question about emojis was relevant because so much of communication now is happening online, right? Social media, memes, for God's sake. And this is how I would say that I don't know where the future would be, but I think the 5 criteria, remember that I gave about a contemporary theory of metaphor, that it should involve both communication and cognition, both more stable and more dynamic. I think they're relatively uncontroversial. And if people can kind of agree these are the set rules, and then within these, we can have like broader or more narrow definitions. This operationalization or that operationalization, then we will find ways to agree. The difficulties and the real conflicts happen. I mean, okay, to finish off with the analogy with the real world that I started, right? is because people stop listening and to the other and just listen to their own bubble.
Okay.
And use only the frames and etc. You know, within that particular review. Open up and take the broader perspective, and then we'll find common ground.
Okay, thank you, Professor Zlatev. I'll go back to the special issue you mentioned, and also thank you very much for the excellent answer. It has been 2 long hours. I'll give the floor to our chairperson today, Celia.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for Professor Zlatev, and thank you, Thomas. It's really been a long discussion part, and thanks for your patience, and your answer is quite inspiring. And also thanks for all the questions and all the audience, which makes this discussion more impressive. So it's 9 o'clock already, and let's call it a day. Thank you again for the impressive and inspiring lecture today. So yeah, I really learned a lot from your lectures, and I think it's again kind of a light up the fire of metaphor study, metaphor and metonymy studies. And I guess most of the audience have the same feelings. And thank you again. So
Thank you very
Thomas,
much.
have anything?
Enjoy your coffee and lunch.
Okay. Thank you once again. I'm impressed that people could stay until 9 o'clock on a Saturday evening to engage and ask questions. I answered as well as I can. As I said at the beginning, my head is not as clear as it could have been if I didn't have this call. I put my email in the chat when somebody asked me, jordan.zlatev@ling.lu. You know, you see it in the chat at the bottom,
Yes,
right?
yes, it's there.
So if you want to ask me more questions, I'll do my best to reply. I can send some references, etc., etc.
Yeah, by email, but not today. It's
Not today, not today. From next week, preferably. I think I need also some rest. Thank you very much again for the invitation. It's been a very
Thank
nice
you.
experience.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.